The World Heritage Site of Bryggen is all that remains of an ancient wharf on the east side of the Norwegian city of Bergen's central harbor, or Bryggen. Bryggen, which means wharf in Norwegian, has been the nerve center of the city for hundreds of years, and the silhouette of its ancient gables is perhaps the best-known image of all of Norway. In the late Middle Ages, the 𝐂𝐨𝐥𝐸𝐿𝐵 established the German Kontor in Bryggen, the waterfront, which became a thriving center of international trade. The characteristic parallel rows of buildings, with their seaward-facing gables, represent a building tradition dating back almost 900 years. Bryggen was founded in 1070 by King Olaf Kyrre. The town was favorably situated in relation to shipping traffic and was for a long time the country's most important commercial, shipping, and industrial town. Soon, Bryggen became a commercial and shipping town of European significance, and for a while during the Middle Ages, it was also the largest urban center in the Nordic countries. It is the only town in the whole of Scandinavia that has followed a classical European pattern of development. The city's oldest urban development and financial center throughout the medieval era was located on Bryggen. The earliest recorded buildings were single-storied post structures, set in parallel rows up from the shore, which in the 11th century lay about 140 meters further inland from today's quayfront. As the need for storage space increased, the buildings were extended into the harbor. By the 13th century, Bryggen had become an important center for European trade, for the kingdom and the church. By this time, Bryggen was a densely built-up area with around 30 tenements. Commercial sailing vessels from the Faroes, the British Isles, the Baltic and continental North Sea ports would lie moored on Vegen in front of the wharfs. It was through the port of Bryggen that the Black Plague entered Norway in 1349, a scourge that ended up killing more than half of the Norwegian population. Around 1360, a Hanseatic Kontor, or trading office, was set up in Bryggen and Bergen, as in Novgorod, Bruges, and London. For the next 4 centuries, the Germans dominated life on Bryggen, where they based their trade in dried fish exports and grain imports. At the times when dried fish was brought down from northern Norway, the wharves and sheds teemed with activity. The 𝐂𝐨𝐿𝐵 Kontor on Bryggen was a male-dominated community, characterized by hard work and strict discipline. The Kontor had its own laws and educational system. Members were not allowed to fraternize with the locals, and especially not with the local women. The position of the Hanseatic League in Europe grew weaker during the 16th and 17th centuries, as various national governments gained greater control over their own trade. Norwegian merchants took over the first Hanseatic firms on Bryggen in 1630, and by 1740, only 9 firms were left in German hands. Many of the German merchants became citizens of Bryggen. The old system remained virtually unchanged, with the Norwegian Kontor adopting Hanseatic regulations and methods of trade, and German remained the everyday language. The disbanding of the Norwegian Kontor in 1899 signaled the end of an old and unique way of trading. Walking through Bryggen's narrow passageways and along the dark-covered balconies, visitors are transported back through the centuries into the dim past of history. Bryggen is not a museum, however, but a living cultural heritage. Today, the area is home to a wide range of shops, artist studios, craft workshops, restaurants, and offices. Bryggen's museums and buildings provide a unique insight into what life was like there from the Middle Ages to the present day. The arrival of the industrial era began to be felt on Bryggen beginning in the 1850s, as the traditional stockfish trade was gradually replaced by new businesses. The old harbor area soon became unsuited to the requirements of modern and rational transportation and storage of goods, and new zoning plans demanded redevelopment. Maintenance was neglected and decay set in. By 1910, the southern part of Bryggen had been torn down and replaced by 5-story brick structures. Norwegian stone architecture bears strong evidence of influence from the West. Anglo-Saxon missionaries brought with them the technique of masonry, built of stone and lime mortar. All through the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, the increase in industrialization and flow of people to the cities gave rise to an explosive growth in house construction. Following National Romanticism's moody atmosphere, there was once again a return to the strict and simple forms and symmetrical motifs that characterized the internationally popular style called neoclassicism. Functionalism became a force in Norway, as well as in the rest of Europe. The fish market in Bryggen, one of the city's many tourist attractions, is also where locals do their daily shopping. Traditionally a place where farmers and fishermen came in from the surrounding districts to sell their produce, the fish market in Bryggen is a culinary phenomenon, and in many ways a unique sight in Bryggen. Here visitors are able to buy freshly caught fish and see the inhabitants of the underwater world such as lobsters and crustaceans brought to daylight. Various water tanks hold live lobsters and crabs. During the summer, the brisk activity of the marketplace is as it has been for centuries, representing an important instance of historical continuity. The market, with its abundance of fish, colorful flowers, fruits and vegetables, together with handicrafts and souvenirs, is a popular destination for photographers seeking to capture Bryggen's lively atmosphere. Viewed from the centers of European art and culture, Norway has traditionally seemed very distant and provincial. Not only was it a poor country, sparsely populated and often impassable, but for centuries its population was dominated by foreign rulers. These reasons explain why Norway lacks the monumental buildings that characterize other European cities, and instead folk traditions dominate building styles. This can be seen especially in the heavy use of wood in Norwegian architecture, which stems from centuries of craftsmanship and experience with the material. Brick began to be used in construction in the 19th century, and the new urban plan with its brick buildings and masonry, along with broad, straight streets, broke with the old building tradition. The proximity to nature and intimacy with inherent qualities of the materials runs like a thread through Norwegian architecture, contributing to its distinctive national characteristics. The old wooden towns were dominated by medieval systems of streets and alleys, which usually led to a harbor or riverfront, where there were rows of boathouses and wharf sheds. Bryggen, the old Hanseatic wharf with its old-fashioned wooden architecture, is not only one of the most passionately disputed neighborhoods in the modern city of Bryggen, but it is also one of the town's most fascinating and distinctive features. The present town plan, which is so characteristic of the wharf, can be traced back to the rebuilding after the fire of 1198. This gives a considerably earlier date for the layout of the town than was hitherto thought. Its physiognomy is characterized by the construction of buildings along the narrow streets running parallel to the docks. The town was laid out in long parallel rows of houses, built two and two together, separated by a passage. In front of this more or less compact row of houses, the quays jutted out slightly into the sea. After each fire, the quays and buildings were built further out, so that little by little, as the demand for new building ground grew, the settlement extended more than 90 meters out into the sea, resting on depths of approximately 10 meters. The houses as well as the quays were built on thick layers of refuse, which in the course of time had been swept off the pierheads and filled out the harbor, making calls by larger ships difficult or even impossible, which in turn provided another good reason for extending the wharf out into the sea. In its present form following the 1702 fire, Bryggen, a harmonious old neighborhood, illustrates the use of space in a court of Hanseatic merchants. It is a type of northern Fondaco, unequaled by even Lübeck or Novgorod. In the Norwegian climate, stone houses were a sign of wealth. It took the efforts of many people to cut stone, and unless one could afford a great deal of fuel, a stone house was cold and uncomfortable. This is why stone has been reserved for both the largest and the smallest projects. Churches and fortresses on the one hand, modest hunters' cabins and fishermen's huts on the other. In the use of wood, Norwegian architecture finds its distinctive qualities. The dynamics of Norwegian wooden architecture stem from its roots in the crossroads between two cultures. From the vast coniferous forest belt of the long valleys of the east came the custom of cog-jointed log houses. From the rugged and fjorded west, with its sparser forests, came the stave tradition, requiring fewer materials. A supporting structure of posts filled in with thinner walls, or sometimes a thin wall with no supporting function, covering the outside. The principle had long been used for barns and outbuildings and was developed to virtuosity in the stave churches. The new bourgeoisie wanted larger and more luxurious houses, and in Bryggen in particular, there are a number of magnificent partition homes from the period. One of the few purely Rococo exteriors is in the Damsgaard, a suburb of Bryggen. A country villa from the late 1700s, it was built to make a strong impression on the ships sailing into Bryggen. The typical Bryggen building is an uninsulated warehouse, 2 or 3 stories high, also called loft. Open galleries facing the courtyard are constructed of wooden posts and beams, while the storerooms are built of notched timber. The roof is a simple rafter structure covered by rough boards under unglazed tiles. Frequently, the foundations of the timber building consist only of crossed layers of logs. Most buildings have a small dormer structure on the roof with a hoist wheel. These were the freight elevators of the day, operated by hand. Cellars at the back of the complex, with iron doors and thick walls, built out of rough-hewn stone, were used as fireproof storage. The German merchants, who were bachelors, took up winter residence in the small wooden houses, and the storerooms were used as individual or collective warehouses. A true colony, Bryggen enjoyed quasi-extraterritoriality, which continued after the departure of the Hanseatic merchants until the creation of the Norwegian trading post in 1754, on the impetus of fishermen and ship owners of German origin. Without resorting to excavation, recent observations on the earliest strata have already greatly changed assumptions about the origin of the town and the topographical situation which preceded it. At that time, there was on the site a fairly wide, sheltered natural bay, cut about 70 meters inland. Its shores were narrow and the mountain rose steeply behind them. These observations provide a more detailed interpretation of the many vague topographical indications, and this may in turn contribute to knowledge of what actually happened in this old district. Attitudes about conservation and the renewal of older buildings have changed radically in the last 15 years. Negative reactions to the large dimensions and rigidity of new buildings, coupled with appreciation of the value of older buildings, has blown new wind in the sails of preservation. The European Programme for Safeguarding the Historical Waterfront of Bryggen and Bergen focused on the development of protection methods using traditional materials, craftsmanship, and techniques in order to safeguard the authenticity of the remaining timber structures and to prevent further decay due to the unknown consequences of new techniques. The crucial obstacle lies in the fact that the present-day state of knowledge prevents us from recreating the way in which the carpenters of old prepared timber and the technologies used at the time the complex was constructed. The state of preservation of the Bryggen settlement complex is also affected by contemporary investments. A few actions are necessary to protect the district, including the repair of roof coverings and drains, the guarantee of suitable ventilation to the wooden foundations, the exchange of the damaged wooden elements of the framework construction, or the limiting of traffic along the quay, and the restoration of the cobblestone street surface. Bergen today is home to 240,000 inhabitants and is a community that immediately makes sense because of its modest scale and the respect its citizens pay to the environment. The people of Bergen practice a way of life that includes modern conveniences, yet demands respect for the air, land, and water. The 1,000-year-old city of Bergen might seem like an unusual place to find inspiration for how to live well in the future, but this picturesque spot is full of such surprises. The inclusion of Bryggen on the list of World Heritage Sites is justified because it is the only remaining part of the Hanseatic Overseas Office, the nucleus of urban development in a marginal part of Europe, and a relic of the ancient Northern European type of wooden urban structures. Surrounded by 7 mountains, Bergen is the gateway to Norway's magnificent fjord region. To experience Bergen on foot by exploring its charming streets and medieval narrow passages gives a visitor an entirely new impression of the city. Bergenhus Fortress was built to protect the entrance to the port of Bergen. It is one of the oldest castles in Norway, whose long history distinguishes it as a center of ecclesiastical, royal, and military activities. The castle comprises 3 areas: Holmen, with the former royal and ecclesiastical buildings, Kungen, and Sverresborg. In 1600s, all 3 areas were joined together into one large fortress. The courtyard between Häcken Hall and the three white 18th century houses is in keeping with its original 17th century design. Excavations have revealed traces of an earlier royal palace made of wood, as well as two previous apostle churches. Of the original medieval buildings, a medieval hall and a defensive tower remain. The Royal Hall, today known as Häcken's Hall, built around 1260, is the largest medieval secular building in Norway. From the late Middle Ages onwards, Norway was without a resident monarchy, and the original functions of the hall lapsed. Around the year 1520, it was used for storage purposes. The second stone hall was erected at about the same time as the Häcken's Hall. The two buildings probably formed an inner courtyard which constituted the innermost core of the defensive fortifications. The barbican is preserved as one of the two gate towers in the wall that encircled the city in the middle of the 13th century. The tower served as the main entrance to the medieval royal palace. The old medieval Rosenkrantz tower was erected around 1270. Rosenkrantz, the feudal overlord, joined several separate buildings into one structure, with the addition of 3 new floors reached by a spiral staircase. The Hanseatic Museum is situated in one of the old trade houses at Bryggen. The museum's interior decoration dates from the 18th and 19th centuries. Bryggen has many splendid churches. The history of the Holy Church of the Cross goes back to 1181, when it was first erected. The name has no connection with today's characteristic cruciform plan, which it acquired in the 17th century when it was extended, first with the south wing and later with the north wing. The church has undergone many extensions, reconstructions, and restorations throughout the ages, often as a result of fires. The church has experienced many changes in both its exterior and interior. The Church of the Cross is a living example of several periods, from its Romanesque nave, fragments of the late Gothic, Renaissance tower, and Baroque wings. The porch in the north end gable is from 1632, when this end was completed. Mariakirken, St. Mary's Church, holds a special place in the history of Bryggen. The first high mass in the church was held in the middle of the 12th century, which means that the church is in fact the oldest surviving building in Bryggen. Mariakirken has always had a central location in town, though it had a far more dominating position in medieval Bryggen, when the country's center of power was just a stone's throw away. Mariakirken has 2 towers, with a Romanesque style and high Gothic characteristics in the stalls. The church received the country's first stained glass window in 1336, when a German glass painting was willed to the church and put into the northern wall. The 19th century Bishop Jacob Neumann and his wife are buried in the churchyard. The German community in Bryggen kept Mariakirken as their own long after the Hanseatic dominance had been broken. However, the Norwegian Parliament passed a bill in 1839 annulling the German congregation in Bryggen. After this, it was no longer an obligation for German descendants to belong to the congregation, only a hereditary and voluntary right. From that point on, 𝐒𝐸𝐾𝐬 increasingly turned into a local parish church, even though sermons were held in German until after the First World War. Late in the 19th century, author Elizabeth Wellhaven described the German society within the church, noting that the Hanseatic descendants remained strongly tied to each other. The congregation at 𝐒𝐸𝐾𝐬 was like a family, who participated in each other's well-being with great seriousness, much like Freemasons. Anyone who has entered into their house of worship has felt the holy and grave atmosphere that rests upon the old German temple. Bryggen has become a symbol of our cultural heritage, and in 1979 gained a place on UNESCO's World Heritage List. The old Hanseatic wharf is architecturally unique and is perhaps one of the most familiar images in all of Norway.